Just want to share, and thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for recording. So to start off our agenda, we're going to start off with just introductions and kind of talking a little bit about our organization, Black Women for Wellness, and our mission. Then we're going to get into a wonderful presentation by our speaker, Blean Girma. Then we're going to do a question and answer chunk of time and share some resources for those living in Los Angeles to address heat stress in your community. And then we'll close. So just starting off, who we are at Black Women for Wellness. Black Women for Wellness is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are committed to the health and well-being of Black women and girls, and we exercise this through health education, empowerment, and advocacy. We have been around since 1997, and in that time, we have created a plethora of wonderful programs, all stemming from our values of reproductive justice and human rights. So all of our programs are around those themes, and they're all exercised in many ways to make sure that we are really seeing our community of people in South Los Angeles, specifically in Leimert Park, California, as the holistic beings that they are. So we have programs ranging from like movement, meditation, plant-based eating, reproductive justice, and addressing the maternal and infant health mortality rate among Black women and girls. And the program we're going to talk a little bit about today is our environmental justice program. So our environmental justice team is made up of 3 people: myself, my wonderful manager, Dr. Astrid Williams, and our program coordinator who just started is lovely Macdella. So the way that we think about environmental justice is twofold, but very connected. So we have kind of 2 buckets of work. One is what we call our built environment initiatives, or our initiatives that are related to the actual physical structures and the neighborhoods that the community we serve lives within. Under that umbrella is our water equity work, our work to eliminate neighborhood oil drilling, and our work to address the harm from the life cycle of plastics pollution. And then our other bucket of work, which is where our environmental justice team was born, is around toxic chemicals in personal care products and how some of the worst toxic chemicals in personal care products are actually found in products marketed primarily and sold primarily to Black women and girls. And what we always want to make the point is that the 2 initiatives, those seeming separate, personal care products and then your built environment, are very much connected, in that if a person is experiencing not great access to water or has not great access to high quality water, and they're living next to an oil drill, and they're experiencing pollution from a highway that they live next to and don't have much green space, and maybe live in an area that's experiences extreme heat, which we'll talk about today, and that person is unfortunately having to use toxic chemicals through their personal care products, then that cumulative effect of all of that harm is great, especially when put into a social justice context, which is that a lot of the same communities we work with might not have equal access to quality healthcare or quality food or other things to really make an entire life well, safe, clean, etc. So we really do think of these 2 buckets as connected, and that's how we'll talk about them today. So one question we get asked a lot and people talk about is, why are we an environmental justice team within a reproductive justice organization? How are the 2 connected? Well, one of the main ways they're connected is when we think about the reproductive justice framework. And the reproductive justice framework has 4 main pillars: that every birthing person has a right to have a child, has a right to not have a child, has the right to parent the child that they have in safe and healthy conditions, regardless of age, race, gender, sexual orientation, immigration status, ability, or economic condition, and that every birthing person has the right to bodily autonomy. So if we look at that third one, that every birthing person, or just every person, should have the right to exist in safe and healthy conditions, regardless of all of these criteria, then that very much aligns with the environmental justice principle, which is that everyone should get to grow up and live in safe and clean neighborhoods. So the principles that we think about and that we're all trying to actualize through our work are extremely aligned. And that's how we think about it as we go about the work that we do, including today. So our Green Table Talk series, which is what we're here experiencing, is a series that's designed to kind of, to talk about different topics kind of under the umbrella of environmental justice or the environment. So we had one table talk about a year ago that was specifically about food injustice, and we had one last July that was about green gentrification, or the reality that as we all do our wonderful work to address environmental injustice in our communities, sometimes that can have a devastating effect of causing displacement or green gentrification, which is the community fighting so hard for change ends up not being the community that actually gets to enjoy that change because they are pushed out. So we talked a lot about how can we avoid displacement throughout doing all the great work. So you can see that green table talk on our website if you're interested in that topic. And we had two very incredible speakers speak on that as well. But today we're going to talk about heat stress as it relates to reproductive justice. So I'm going to give just a primer as to kind of why are we talking about this at all. And then I'm going to introduce our speaker to really dig deep into the effects of heat stress on pregnancy, childhood development, etc. So the goal again today is to understand the connection between reproductive justice and global warming is one goal. The second goal is to share about the effects of heat stress on pregnancy, as well as to offer resources for birthing people to stay protected in extreme heat. So first off, I know everyone's coming at this meeting for different perspectives and varying levels of involvement in sort of environmental justice work or environmental work in general. But just because I want to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm just giving a primer into what is climate change? What do we say when we say climate change, which is a huge buzz term now? What do we say when we say global warming, which is another huge buzz term right now? Well, the first is that the two are separate, but right now connected. So climate change refers to change in temperature patterns on a seasons level, on a decades level. So when we're thinking about long spans of time, global warming is when the climate is changing in a way that is heating. So ever since the pre-industrial period, or in the 1800s, human beings have been seriously and drastically burning fossil fuels and using fossil fuels, which are oil, gas, and coal. This creates an effect of trapping heat within Earth's atmosphere, and then our climate ends up changing. So since this pre-industrial period, our Earth has actually increased temperature by about 1 degree Celsius. Now, I remember when I was first learning about these things, I was like, 1 degree, that does not seem like that serious of a thing, but it is. And that difference that we're all experiencing, that 1 degree Celsius or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, is what we're all experiencing now. So living in the world, all of this, the extreme heat that we see everywhere, a lot of that is related to that single degree Celsius difference, which is actually increasing now. And all of this is 100% the result of human activity, which is that humans we have made our lives intertwined with fossil fuels or burning oil and gas through travel, think of cars or planes, through plastics, when we make plastics that come from fossil fuels because they are made of byproducts of fossil fuels. All of this has created a warming effect on our climate. And unfortunately, the effects of this warming are not evenly distributed. So globally, developing countries are going to be 2 to 5 times more exposed to heat waves than rich countries by 2060. But even now, we can see that certain developing countries and in general, places are experiencing heat unevenly. In the United States, there was a recent study done that looked at 108 cities, and it found that neighborhoods that were formerly redlined, redlining meaning that between about the 1930s and around 1968, these were neighborhoods that were drawn lines around them, and these were neighborhoods that were intentionally disinvested in and where resources were intentionally left out of. So when you look at those neighborhoods that were redlined across many cities, you can see that those neighborhoods are hotter oftentimes than the neighborhoods that were not redlined. And this study found that that difference could be as much as 13 degrees, especially on extreme heat days. So we see that systemic racism and very intentional public planning, but horrible public planning urban planning has created a lot of the extreme heat and uneven burden that we see today. And then if we dig even deeper, specifically to the southwestern United States, where we are in Los Angeles, we see that this effect is still true. So lower income neighborhoods of the southwestern US region experience hotter temperatures as well. So overall, when we think about the effect of our climate changing and getting warmer. And then when we kind of funnel that down into what we're actually experiencing in Los Angeles, and then what people are experiencing across cities in this country, we see that communities that are Black, communities that are brown, communities that are Indigenous, communities that are primarily BIPOC, which are the communities that were redlined, are the communities that experience more heat stress, that experience greater effects from extreme heat days. So how is this related to RJ? So we talked about the reproductive justice framework. Well, these effects that we're talking about related to extreme heat very directly go against one's reproductive justice rights. So there can be health complications related to extreme heat exposure, which Blean is going to get into, so I won't dig too much into that. And that directly violates a birthing person's right to have a child. Then we talked a little bit about the environmental justice principle that very much connects to the reproductive justice principle, but everyone having a right to live in a safe and healthy place. Well, this right is being threatened by environmental injustice in that Black and brown neighborhoods in cities are often hotter than others. And then the right to bodily autonomy, which is the reality that none of us on this call, none of us in general, consented to living in a warming world. None of us consented to living in neighborhoods that are hotter than surrounding neighborhoods or that are experiencing what we call the heat island effect, which is when one area of an urban environment experiences more extreme heat than the other area, in part because of a lack of green space, trees to absorb those things. So the conversation that we're having today around heat stress and extreme heat and its effect on all people, but specifically on birthing people, is very much relevant to the conversations around reproductive justice. So just kind of leaning back into the goals. So the first goal was around connections between RJ and global warming. So we started off having that conversation, and I'm going to pass it over to Blean to continue the conversation. So I want to introduce Blean Girma, and I will pin her so that people can see. Blean Girma is a first-generation Ethiopian American, born and raised in LA, California, an alumni of Culver City High School. She graduated with a bachelor's in biology at Mount St. Mary's University in 2016, and then obtained her MPH from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City in 2019. Ms. Girma has been developing epidemiological research on the impact of extreme heat on children's health for about 5 years, working with the Region 2 Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit. Ms. Girma is also co-founder and chair of the Black Child Health Working Group at Mount Sinai. Her research interests focus on examining the interactions between the social environment and physical environment and their impacts on the health of youth and women of underserved communities. She hopes to lead community-based participatory research projects within Black and African diaspora communities while contributing to the transformation of public health epidemiological research through anti-racist methods and practices. So we are very thankful to have her here today. Just a few Zoom reminders are to please remain muted while the speaker is speaking, but we very much welcome your Zoom reactions, so the hearts, the claps, all of it, we love it. We also encourage people to please comment questions or reactions in the chat. I will be following those, and then we have 20 minutes blocked out for your questions today, so please do not hold back on the questions. So thank you all. I'm going to pass it over to Ms. Girma.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Okay, everyone can see my first slide. All right. Okay. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. As in my case, I'm calling in from New York City right now. My name is Blean Girma, and I will be continuing our conversation on reproductive justice in the warming world. So as Tiana explained earlier, the Earth's global average temperatures have been increasing, and this is mostly driven by industrial development, which is responsible for the spewing out of greenhouse gases, which trap the heat into our environment. And in addition to that, the industrial development that has been going on for decades have formed built environments that also trap and amplify this heat that is felt by certain communities. And this is due to the urban heat island effect. So due to a combination of heat absorbing surfaces like concrete and dark pavement, and the lack of trees and other vegetation, and heat generating activities like cars and generators, large urban areas can experience higher temperatures during hot weather more than rural communities. So here is a heat map of the US showing the difference in temperature between urban areas and rural vegetated areas due to how much concrete and heat absorbing surfaces there are in certain areas. And so this is simply a map that shows the distribution of the urban heat island effect on a national level. And here is a heat map of Los Angeles County. And you can see that heat is much more concentrated in central parts of the county, like near the valleys areas. But heat is also pretty well distributed throughout the Southwest and South Central neighborhoods in the greater LA area, which is shown in orange around here, which is, as most of you would know, a densely populated and urbanized area. Okay, so with exposure to higher and higher ambient temperatures, more frequently and amplified in urban areas, many are at risk of heat stress. So heat stress happens when your body can't get rid of excess heat. And this means that your core body temperature and heart rate increase. And from there, that triggers a physiological response throughout your body, putting you at risk of heat-related illnesses and other health outcomes. So some factors that make you more vulnerable to heat stress are obviously high ambient temperature, also high humidity. If it's really humid outside, the water content in the air doesn't allow your body to perform evaporative cooling through sweating. So that doesn't allow you to regulate your temperature, your body temperature very well. And then physical activity or your occupation, for example, farm workers who work extremely hard throughout the whole year are at risk of experiencing heat stress. And your geography and lack of acclimatization due to shifting timing of seasons. So acclimatization is basically your body's ability to withstand and be used to the temperature or the changes in temperature around you. So for example, someone living in the desert where the temperatures don't seem to vary that extremely from, and don't have very extreme changes in season. It's mostly just like a winter and summer. Might not have like a big of an issue in this case. But for example, in the Northeast, where there's a dramatic change through every season, the 4 seasons, with one of the most, forgotten impacts of climate change is that it is also shifting the timing of seasons and the timing of when temperature is changing. So if there is a really dramatic increase in temperature during the springtime in the Northeast, like in New York, some people might not be prepared or ready, or even your body is not prepared to experience that from going from 50, 40 degree temperatures all the way up to like 80s, especially with this humidity here. Doesn't really even have to get that hot for it to feel really extreme. Okay. So extreme heat can have various impacts on humans, and some are more obvious than others. So when people think of heat-related illnesses and outcomes, they think of the risk of death or of going to the hospital or for heat stroke. Or others may think about how hard it is for people to think or work in heat because it makes them uncomfortable and exhausted. But when you think of the number of cases that this happens or is documented, that's very small compared to the larger population that are potentially impacted by heat, but are not noticed as heat-related illnesses or directly linked to heat stress. So that would be called like a subclinical effect. And so this brings us to how heat is potentially impacting the reproductive health of many birthing people today. So here are some reproductive health outcomes associated with high ambient temperature. Preterm birth, low birth weight, and preeclampsia or high blood pressure during pregnancy are the most commonly known and like supported by evidence. So some of the Tiana was like, when we were going through this, she was interested in like, what are the actual mechanisms that could be going on? And so some hypothesized reasons are, one, dehydration can cause like reduced uterine blood flow and trigger the release of certain hormones, along with oxytocin, which is known to cause labor. So that could lead to early labor. Or heat may impair molecular mechanisms in placental and early fetal development. And three, although only found in animal studies, it is hypothesized that heat stress triggers increase in oxytocin secretion and prostaglandin release, which are known to trigger labor. And four, an outcome which is important to me and what mine and some of my colleagues have done research on is focusing on the potential impacts of heat on mental health and behavior. So it is understood that extreme heat exposure may cause an imbalance of serotonin, which is needed to regulate your mood. And sleep is another important factor in regulating your mood and mental health. And a very common phenomenon, I don't know if many of you understand this experience, but a lot of times in urban areas, when it's hot during the day, it is really hot at night. That heat is emitting off of that concrete. And so a lot of people have a hard time sleeping in summer nights, for example. So with all that together, we can make some connections with some studies that have found that excessive maternal emotional stress is a risk factor for adverse fetal development and associated with preterm birth and low birth weight and neurodevelopmental issues in infants. So there's potentially, a lot of like risks that may not be directly linked, but we can make some hypotheses based off of what we know in one aspect and what we know in another field and make connections. But it is difficult to be able to get the direct mechanism, especially in a pregnant population, their vulnerable population, that you're not really able to do much research with. So a lot of these outcomes are based off of observed like observational studies, epidemiological studies based off of data. So we don't mean to draw like causal links or like saying this is definitely the reason for this, but with the knowledge of these outcomes, you should be able to, be more alerted, or like when you're talking to your doctor, bring up your concerns when it comes to these things. So yeah. Okay, so now if we zoom out to see the big picture, we can see several things are at play in perpetuating the potential risks of heat on reproductive health, as we just spoke about. So we can see that certain policies and practices and funding mechanisms regarding the built environment or urban communities have led to the creation of the urban heat island effect, which we talked about, and other health disparities that are unrelated to heat, and a lack of access to heat protective resources, which then all play onto each other to lead to heat-related health disparities, and then further perpetuating generational health disparities for certain communities. So for example, we can think of a young woman living in Los Angeles in a poor built environment where she doesn't have much shade and maybe doesn't have AC in her home, goes through a relatively fine pregnancy, but has a premature birth, and that child then might have to tackle certain like issues in their health that may touch on or impact other aspects of that child's life as they grow up or their family. And thus, we can see how this can have generational impacts. And we know that a lot of these policies and practices and funding mechanisms at play are environmentally racist. Based off of this example, I'm sure many of you have heard of redlining, and Tiana had mentioned earlier that it's a practice which started in the 1930s, which was done across the United States, where banks followed racist practices in determining what neighborhoods were deemed valuable enough to guarantee a mortgage loan. And the generational impacts of the historical practice, which is technically not in practice anymore, are still seen today, from the poor built environment of certain communities to adverse health outcomes that are even not related to heat. So this map explains most of the warmest areas in Los Angeles were also neighborhoods that were given low grades and discouraged to be invested in when that practice started in the 1930s. So I don't know how clear this is, but you can see like where it's red, you see a lot of D's and C's. And where it's blue and cooler, you see a lot of A's and B's. And sometimes it mixes, neighborhood compositions move around and different, areas get industrialized as time goes on, or gentrification, all of that are part of it, but there's still a very clear pattern here. And this pattern is very similar in many other cities across the United States. So how is this related to reproductive justice? As Tiana explained again, reproductive justice states that we have the right to parent the children we have in safe and healthy conditions, regardless of age, race, gender, sexual orientation, immigration status, ability, or economic condition. And so based off of what I spoke about, we can see that this right has been potentially threatened by health complications related to extreme heat exposure. And this right has been threatened by environmental injustice on Black and brown neighborhoods in cities that are more often hotter than others. And yes, none of us have consented to live in this warming world. And although many of us have participated in it, we weren't the ones as the corporations or, in system-wide decided, sometimes knowingly, that certain consequences would happen for certain communities. So what's being done now? Based off of that flow chart I shared with you, one of the most points or the pivotal points that we can be acting on is building these communities' climate resilience. And so just some examples of what some organizations have done to do this is by continuing to educate and advocate. So an example I like to share is the community-based organization We Act for Environmental Justice based in New York City, who are a great example of how they support climate resilience through education and policy advocacy. So for example, in 2021, they created a report auditing cooling centers in Northern Manhattan. So seeing the quality or accessibility of cooling centers in the area. And last year, they created an extreme heat policy agenda to make policy and strategy recommendations to prepare New Yorkers for the rising temperatures and mitigating the resulting potential health risks. And this is a cool infographic that they made. And please, at the end, I can share any of the stuff that I've posted here or any of the studies or papers that I based off of, that I sourced all the presentation on. And also by building climate resilience by continuing research and planning with communities' voices. So some academic and clinical programs like Facing the Sun at Emory University and the Migrant Clinicians Network work directly with community members to learn more about the health impacts of heat on farm workers and migrants, and building climate management plans and interventions alongside these community members, with the goal of making these communities resilient. So always important for academic institutions and other organizations to integrate communities' voices and for communities to go and seek to give their voices. And so hopefully with this information, you're more able to and likely to. And lastly, one big thing that I always think about within Black and Brown communities is the importance of maintaining social capital within your community. So a program that was launched in New York City some years ago was called Be a Body, and basically was to tackle the issue in that a lot of elderly were at risk of mortality, of passing away in their homes, because a lot of them live alone and are not able to regulate their temperature as well, and don't really know, or don't act on getting to a cooling place or getting into a cool environment when it's really hot outside. So the point of Be a Buddy was creating systems of connection between neighbors or community members or family members to call up an elderly person that you know and make sure that they're keeping cool during a heat wave or really hot day. And so I can think of this translated to pregnant women and birthing people, to make sure you're always keeping in community and connection with each other, to protect each other, and to share your resources with each other. So that I'll say thank you, and please let me know if you have questions. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. So if anyone would like to type a question in the chat, or if you want to come off mute and ask a question, we do have some time for them. I see one person asked about sharing LA specific resources. And so we will be sharing them after the question section, but I'll link in a link if anyone wants to look at them now because they're curious. But yeah, if anyone has any questions.
So would you say that being in air-conditioned spaces and keeping cool while you're pregnant can reduce the risk of preeclampsia and thrombosis?
Well, I can't make that direct link, right? There are other risk factors for thrombosis and preeclampsia, but definitely would recommend any birthing person, pregnant person, to stay cool. Yeah.
Any other questions? I'll give it another minute or two, and then if not, I can jump into the resources. Maybe people have questions about those. Okay, well, we will jump into resources. If anyone does have questions, we can pause and answer them in the chat or otherwise. So I will get started. Thank you so much, Ms. Girma.
Please feel free, Tiana, to share my contact with anyone who wants.
Did have one quick question on one of the slides where you did the map layover with the heat stress areas, percentage minorities to tree shading. There was impervious. Did you define that, or I don't know if you can explain what that means, how that relates to the issue?
So you're saying what does impervious mean, or did I?
Yes, and how it contributes to the problem.
Yeah, so Impervious means heat. It's like basically another way of saying like heat absorbing, or like surfaces that don't allow for, you can even say surfaces that just hold on to heat and can emit it. So it's like saying concrete, or like pavement and all of that. So basically, as I like explained before, that these type of surfaces hold on to heat and release heat. So it makes a magnified experience. It's not just the heat that comes directly from the heated atmosphere, but then it's like a reflective feeling bouncing off of the surface of the ground.
Oh, cool.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I had one question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi there. I live in Los Angeles and I loved your presentation. Thank you so much. I am a registered nurse, and one of my concerns is, are there any ways that your communities are doing anything to address this, as far as maybe more parks and areas where people that are pregnant can go and have access to areas where there are not concrete jungles, having access to maybe areas where there are coolant systems, where you go and they have the sprayers, the misting areas. Are anything's being done in the community to address this? Because, when we talk about housing, we can't say, well, you now live in an apartment where there's no central air, so let's figure out how to do that. That's a huge win, but some smaller things that can be done in the community. So are there any things that are being done in the communities where you live that are addressing this, so that maybe we can think of doing those in our LA communities? Because I know you're back east.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, being from LA, I know the feeling. I grew up with no AC. So I know that feeling. But yeah, there are citywide like programs promoting the existence of cooling centers. Maybe if we go through that report that WeAct had done, that I mentioned, we can see like how well they are and like how much access people actually have to them and all of that. And also, I believe there is, I guess, combined with energy efficiency and all of that going on in the city, and like a lot of like research and advocacy going into who has like access to AC and are they actually using the AC and all of that. But I can get more detailed examples of like what's going on, like program wise, if you want examples.
Yeah, because I just think like in Los Angeles, we have a lot of grant funding for various things. And this could be something, Black Women for Wellness, they do so many amazing things in the community, but this could be an area to think about. We have, lactation stations, but maybe there's something related to hydration stations or cooling stations, something that can really help address that for those areas where women are really in need of this, but don't have the resources or the money in order to do this in their own, intimate space. So maybe it's a more environmental space thing. So thank you.
I see another question. Are there initiatives of engaging and empowering women and others in local and community, as well as national policy, to address reproductive justice from the heat stress and climate change influences with policymakers? Are you aware of anything, Lee?
Honestly, I will say I'm not aware of anything, but I could research more, but I feel like that's a big gap and why I'm like so passionate about this. Yeah.
I'm not either. I do know in LA, or in California, I should say, there is a policy, I believe it's SB 57, which is a policy that's being co-sponsored by one of our partner organizations, Physicians for Social Responsibility at LA. And that one is around making sure that utility companies, it hasn't passed yet, it's going through the cycle now, is to help make it so that utilities on extreme heat days cannot turn off someone's power for lack of payment. So that would mean if somebody hasn't paid or is unable to pay, then the utilities on days where it is extremely hot can't shut off someone's power or has to keep their power on. So that someone, if they do have access to an AC or do have access to fans or things that require power to stay cool, then they can access those things. So that's one policy that touches on, I think, helping people stay cool, especially in our communities. And then when I jump into the resources, I can also share, there are maps in LA that have been created that specify, like, this is a park, this is a library where you can cool off, and I can show that in a moment. I just want to see if there's any other questions in the chat before I do that. If anyone
I
has
can, I would just also really encourage anywhere that there can be efforts to collaborate in those policy areas. There's nothing, I mean, there's a lot of things that are beautiful, but a person who's pregnant who, you know, is carrying the future is so beautiful. And I think that that could be a really empowering message to our policymakers if they truly are supportive of policies so that kiddos can be raised and have all of the things that, you know, the goals is to be able to have that reproductive justice, and kind of pushing back against the rhetoric that, you know, that they say that they're putting policies in place, because we know that they have not been, not only historically, as eloquently pointed out, but also in the future. And so, you know, if there's ways to collaborate with, you know, the physicians of social responsibility, with other nursing entities, climate change, I think that could really strongly support the critical need, so that reproductive justice and opportunities for persons who are pregnant to be able to access those things that are so needed.
I agree. Collaboration is so incredibly important, and it's something we're trying to do. And I will share that we at Black Women Wellness hosted a heat focus group a couple of weeks ago. So we had people come in and we spent 2 hours with partners at UCLA and the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, who's working right now on policies related to heat, talking through, like, what are solutions that people in our community in South LA think are necessary. And one of the things that came up was misting. Like, people talked about, like, having misting areas, and that was important, green space. So we're hoping that some of those things will be implemented, at least at the city level, and we're waiting to hear back. But there are some resources, thankfully, that are still available. So I'm going to share a couple of those. Please still feel free to post questions in the chat. And if you have more afterwards, I put my information, and I'll be sending a follow-up email to everybody who RSVP'd. So everyone who's on the call, and then if you have friends who weren't able to make it but RSVP'd, they'll also get the resources as well. Sorry, let me just move. Okay, so one I want to share, and Blean, maybe you can share a little bit more about this, is a conference that's coming up specifically about heat and the impacts on children and pregnancy. Maybe you could share a little bit more about that one.
This was actually shared with me by my PI, Perry Sheffield's on this call right now. But basically, it's sponsored, you know, and supported by Cali VA and PACU and OEHA. But basically, it's going to be a symposium where people from wherever can come listen more about what I was talking about today. Yeah, and there's some agenda here if you want to look into more about who will be presenting, if you're interested.
Yes, and I will again share this resource or this upcoming event as well in the follow-up email. So if you do live in LA, there's a couple of resources, and a lot of these were shared to us by our partners at UCLA and the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office. So Cool Spots LA is a map that you can go to, which I'll share as well, and you can go to, and it shows you areas that you can go to that are public access that are cool. So one big one is libraries. So going to public libraries in your community on extremely hot days. There's also LA like hydration stations that are outdoors. Parks, there's more swimming pools and splash areas opening for people to go to stay cool. And all of those are being compiled into Cool Spots LA's map so that you can go type in your zip code and you can see exactly what's close to you. Another resource is Notify LA. So the city of LA will use many ways to reach you if there's a threat. And I believe one of them is heat these days. So that's another opportunity for people. There are cooling centers. So there are cooling centers that are open for days when there is excessive heat. I think one option is to go to @ReadyLA, which I believe is their Twitter. But you could also, I think, having contacts with your representative. So whatever city council district you live in, different representatives are doing more to put that information on their websites. But going to the Cool Spots access or Cool Spots webpage is also helpful. In terms of rides, LA DOT offers air-conditioned rides from surrounding areas to mini cooling centers through the Dash bus line. And then as well, there aren't enough hydration stations. And I do want to be clear, there are not enough resources for anyone yet. They're kind of just now becoming a thing, but there are some that hopefully people can access, especially since I know it's almost April, but I'm already, waiting for it to get hot in a couple of months. So just being prepared, I think, is helpful. And then there are things about a lot around planning a day. So one of the things that's an option for everybody, but specifically birthing people, if you have the access to, is to plan days around the main heat hours. So in the mornings and in late evenings, it might not be as hot outside. So that might mean that during the day, if you have chores like getting groceries or you want to go see a movie or something, that doing those during peak heat time, so in the afternoons, can be helpful so that you will be in a cool area when you're doing those things. And then doing home chores like cleaning up, doing laundry, whatever, during the cooler times of the day can be helpful as well. So being intentional about planning a day when it's extremely hot. Another option is, especially if you don't have air conditioning, taking cool showers or baths is really helpful. Trying to use the stove less often is helpful. One of the things that I do is I sew these little it's a t-shirt basically that I put rice in, and then I put it in the freezer. And on hot days, I take them out and I put them on my neck and under my armpits, because those are places that can cool your body temperature down really quickly. So making sure that I'm trying to stay cool, and then prepping home. So if having trouble affording energy bills, there are low income assistance programs. And then as well, if this policy passes, then ideally, if someone hasn't paid their bill, they'll be able to keep energy on as well. So fingers crossed that passes. And then again, I mentioned cooling off your day, and then going outside, wearing a hat if possible, wearing sunscreen, making sure that if you're sweating a lot, making sure that you are drinking a lot of water. I think the clinical suggestion is between half or your body weight in ounces. So if you weigh 150 pounds, you would be drinking 75 to 150 ounces of water every day. And then also making sure to replace your electrolytes that you lost. So that's drinking like Gatorades or electrolyte enriched water, talking to your primary care provider or your general practitioner around these things to make sure, in case you have other reasons why you might need to drink more or less water, depending on, your medical situation. So really confirm that with your doctor. And then wearing lightweight clothing and being intentional again about planning days. So these are just a few things to take with you today. I know, again, it is not enough, but we're working on more resources. And then all of the resources that I mentioned can be accessed at this QR code, or a lot of them can be accessed at this QR code if you want to scan. But the link again will also be in the follow-up email. So I'm just going to quickly check to see if there's any questions. Oh, I see someone mentioning never knew RJ and climate change and global warming was a thing. Thank you. I'm so glad that this has been helpful. It's exactly what we want to hear. So the final takeaways from us to you is exactly that heat stress and reproductive justice are connected. I know myself and Ms. Girma mentioned that a couple times, and that's because you do want to draw those connections, because it is so important for all of us to be aware. And then we at Black Women for Wellness are here for you. So please stay connected. Please reach out if you have questions or if you need resources to stay cool this summer. And Ms. Girma already said that she is willing to share her email. So if you live on the East Coast and live in New York and have questions, then she will be a great resource for you. So that concludes our presentation today. I do ask if you wouldn't mind taking 3 minutes to complete an evaluation so we can keep making our events better. Here's the QR code. You can scan that. Again, it will be in the follow-up email as well. But otherwise, this concludes our session today. We still